Now, this is a very esoteric subject, but the most important subject I've spoken about. And I haven't spoken about this since 2007. Now, this is about the use of direct democracy in Victorian, basically, reformist and radical movements. So I'm going to break this up into 4 sections. The first one, I'm going to make a definition of what delegation is, what direct democracy is. Then I'm going to give a historical background of pre-colonisation. Then I'll look at what happened during the Eureka Rebellion, and then I'll look at the most important part that I'm looking at that I'm trying to analyse is the post-Eureka Rebellion, because everybody seems to forget that the Eureka Rebellion didn't end on the 3rd of December 1854. It began in 1854. It didn't end basically to the beginning of the 20th century. So, what's direct democracy? Now, everybody talks about democracy, but we don't define what democracy is. The traditional definition of democracy is rule of the people, by the people, for the people. But I've added a 4th component to that. It's not original, but it's got to be rule of the people, by the people, for the people, by an engaged public. If the public isn't engaged in the democratic process, then minorities will take over the structures and institutions which have been created to rule. And it's a simple process. The public has to be engaged in the process. So what's the difference between direct democracy and representative democracy? Representative democracy is when you cast a ballot, whether it's a secret ballot or an open ballot, and you elect somebody for a fixed period of time to make decisions for you. And during that fixed period of time, in the majority of cases, you have no resort to recall that individual who represents you till the next time there is an election. And that's what parliamentary democracy is about. In some states in the United States of America, they have what they call a recall process. And if a certain percentage of people sign a petition to have a fresh election because the representative is not representing them, then a fresh election has to be called before the next election. So representation, those of you who remember what checks are, is like standing on a street corner and handing out signed blank checks to individuals. Because I could promise you whatever I like and deliver nothing, even if I'm in government. And that happens over and over again, as we see. That's what representation means. It means that you only come out at election time to make your choice, to elect a representative. Whether you do it by first past the post, preferential voting, or the Hare-Clark system, which they use in Tasmania, is irrelevant. A representative, as we've seen in Parliament over and over again, can change their political party in between elections. As we recently saw for the Green Senator, who joined the Labor Party within a few weeks of the last federal election. You can get people becoming independents. You can get people crossing the floor and joining other parties. And you didn't vote for that, and there's nothing you can do about it. That's representation. Now, what is direct democracy? This is what a lot of radical elements talk about. Direct democracy is based on a delegation system. And if there are any trade unionists amongst you, not these days, but possibly in the past, delegation, having a delegate was exceptionally important. A lot of protest groups have a delegation system. So what happens is, on a particular issue, you make a decision, then you appoint a delegate to enter into discussions with other delegates who've been appointed by other groups about that particular decision. You may come to a compromise decision, and then as a delegate you take that back to the original assembly and ask them to ratify that final decision. So in a delegation system, what you do is, one, you define what the topic is. What is the issue? Two, you have the power to remove that delegate at any time if they don't carry out the wishes of that meeting. And three, it's democracy pure form of democracy in that terms, because it's rule of the people, by the people, for the people, by an engaged public. So there is a huge difference between representation and delegation. So representative democracy, direct democracy. People talk about the death of democracy in the Western world, around the world. And there is a death of parliamentary democracy. And what we see is with the death of parliamentary democracy, we've seen the rise, which we saw in the 20s and 30s, which we're seeing now, of parliamentary focused authoritarian groups. Because representation has not delivered the goodies to people, and they feel totally disenfranchised. So representative democracy is dead. When you get people like Putin being re-elected, you get Mr. Kim being elected with 96% of the vote, you realise that representative democracy is a sham. And even in our society, we are now suffering that issue. So the question is direct democracy some new invention, or is direct democracy a mechanism which people, irrespective of their colour or gender or whatever, use to make decisions when the structures which are there that make decisions no longer satisfy the wish of the people? So let's now look at this part you all know, but I'll go through it again. Let's look at Victorian history. It's important that I put this in a historical context to see how these movements for direct democracy were created. Now, as we know, local people lived here, or the traditional owners lived here, First Nations people, for over 60,000 years. They had their own mechanism of making decisions. They had a form of direct democracy, but they also had a council of elders who actually either ticked or disapproved of those decisions that had been made. And the fact that this council of elders were in that position was because there was no written record, and they were the keepers of knowledge. They knew where the food was, they knew when the drought hit, where to find water, where to find food, how to protect, the clan, the tribe from other tribes. They knew that. So therefore, the population as a whole came to a consensus. And we see this now in the Northern Territory and other areas where traditional Aboriginal structures continue and Torres Strait Islander structures continue despite colonisation. We see a consensus type of decision making. For example, we've just seen this in the last 24 hours. They're going to create a huge solar farm in central Australia, right? It took 3 years of negotiations to get approval from the traditional owners. There are only about 800 traditional owners, but they've now come to a position where they've given approval for the next 75 years to go down a particular track. Whether the corporation will go down that track or not, who knows, but that's consensus decision making. So that's traditional structures. Now, when Europeans first came to this country and they settled this country, there were two groups: soldiers and sailors and government officials, which represented the monarchy, and there were convicts, who were basically free labour. So there was no real democracy of any type. It was ruled through flogging, through the gallows, through punishment. You did what you were told, basically. So in Victoria, the first settlement was at Sorrento in 1803, and that was abandoned because nobody thought about a fresh water supply. And after 6 months it failed, and they moved on to Hobart, to colonise Tasmania. There was another attempt in 1825 at the Churchill Island, again no water supply. But in 1835, the Free Enterprise came across to Melbourne. Now, the Free Enterprise was not a government initiative. It was an initiative which was put forward by ex-convicts and landowners in Tasmania to exploit land in Victoria, because this is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, And what the Industrial Revolution required was wool. So when human hovel crossed Victoria, they saw two things. One, they saw the local tribes, many of them had smallpox scars on them, and many of the encampments had been abandoned. Some of them were permanent camps that had been abandoned because of the disease which had come down from Port Jackson since 1788, and it's laid waste.
So that's how many years later?
About, so they came in 1835, 1788, what's that, 47 years later. Right. So the actual structures were already under stress. Now, when people arrived here, the British government had to somehow regain control from these entrepreneurs who turned up and, like Mr. Batman, signed dubious treaties with the Kulin, representatives of the Kulin nations. I think it was Warrafong people. So you've got this situation where you've got original owners in a weakened position because of disease. You've got huge tracts of land which have been farmed in a traditional manner for thousands of years by the use of fire. So when human hovel crossed Victoria, they could not believe the grazing lands that were available to the graziers which were coming down, from Tasmania, coming up and coming down from New South Wales. They could not believe that there were these huge tracts of grasslands. But these huge tracts of grasslands were created over thousands of years by the use of fire and agricultural techniques which Aboriginal people used to, husband animals, which they could slaughter, and more importantly, cultivate and dig up, because it's a hunter-gatherer society, Murnion. Now, Murnion is a tuber, and it's well known that about 80% of the food which is gathered by women in traditional Aboriginal society. And if the men came back with a kangaroo after a 3-day hunt, the place would be celebrated. So their traditional food was Murnion, right? So what happens when sheep were introduced? Now, sheep were introduced very rapidly because of the diminished number of Aboriginal people and disease which had been caused havoc among the traditional owners. And what we saw is people with assets. Say the fourth son of a baron, the illegitimate son of a prince, turning up in Victoria with assets and to bring sheep. But you just don't need sheep. You need sheep, you need cheap labour, which is convicts or returned convicts in Victoria, people who've been on ticketed leave or are paid a peppercorn, and you need land. And what we saw was a hidden frontier war, which you all know about, which resulted in the reduction of the Aboriginal population within 12 years of colonisation, beginning in 1835, to less than 2,000 individuals. It's claimed that over 95,000 Aboriginals were slaughtered during that period of this hidden frontier war. And the war was a hidden frontier war because in 1837 at Lambing Flats in New South Wales, the reformist government in England had been receiving all these reports about all these atrocities, and 7 shepherds were hung for slaughtering 28 years of old men, women and children.
Mile Creek,
sorry. Well, not Lambing Flat, Mile Creek, thank you. Mile Creek. So people knew there could be consequences. So it was a hidden frontier war. Right. So by 1850, the whole of Victoria had been claimed by 720 squatters. And they claimed that land in order to keep sheep, grow wool, and send wool to the industrial mills in England. Okay? So you've got this situation. You've got the Aboriginal population has basically been wiped out. They've been treated as noxious vermin. You get rid of them, you take over the land, you take over the water supply, the fresh water supply. At the same time, those Aboriginal groups that continue to survive in the more arid regions of Victoria were faced with starvation because the sheep were eating the murnion. And the murnion wasn't growing back because they were ripping the murnion up, roots and all. When Aboriginals harvested it, they harvested the yam. They didn't actually, destroy it. So you've got this situation. 1850, you've got about 50,000 people in Victoria. Most of them ticket of leave men and women who've come down from New South Wales or come from Tasmania. Cheap labour for the landowners, about 720 squatters, and most of these squatters weren't the type we have, squatting empty buildings. These were people who squatted empty land, which had been created empty through a program of genocide. Right. Now, on the 1st of January 1851, the colony of Victoria was declared. But the English government was very concerned about these squatters because it meant it didn't have control. The Crown didn't have full control of the land in Australia. So in 1847, they passed through Parliament what's called a standing order to try to regain control from these entrepreneurs who had squatted this land. And what they did in Victoria, which I'll talk about tonight, is they divided Victoria into 3 regions. Settled regions, which was basically Melbourne and a little bit of the environs, and there were no squatters in that area. And the people who lived there who had land held freehold title. And there was a huge difference between leasehold and freehold, which I'll talk about in a minute. Right? Then they said the western region, which is Mornington Peninsula.
No, it's not. That's Western Port.
Now, they used to call the western region, all that area like that. And then you had Gippsland, you had the western region, then you had Gippsland. It wasn't the west as we know it now. There was a western region, there was Wimmera, there was the Mallee, and there was northeast Victoria. So they said the CBD, Melbourne, freehold title. People buy and sell land. Fine. It's theirs. They can do what they like with it as long as they pay for it. In the what they call the intermediate settled regions, which was the western region, and Gippsland, the leaseholders, the people who had not leased this land, but who had acquired the land and squatted the land, became leaseholders overnight. And in the semi-settled areas, they were able to buy land at auction within a mile of their homestead, and the rest of the land they had squatted became leasehold for 8 years, and at the end of 8 years it theoretically went to auction, open auction. Then you had the unsettled areas, and obviously in those areas the standing order said that anybody who had squatted land in the unsettled areas, which was northeast Victoria, Wimmera and Mallee, they said you could have a lease for 15 years of that land that you squatted, and after the lease expires, you are the only person who can buy that land. So you can imagine people offering a penny an acre, right? That was the standing orders in 1847, which basically legalised the theft of the land by the squatters. It gave them a legal standing in British law, depending on where you found yourself. At the same time, the British Crown, trying to formalise the situation, wanted the land surveyed so they could peg out where the boundaries were. But the squatters refused to have the land surveyed, because once the land was surveyed, they felt that they would lose control of a lot of the area. So here we have 1850, 1851, Victoria is created by an act of the British Parliament. They set up a legislative council where 2/3 of the members are appointed by the government, one further elected, but to stand for election you need to own £2,000 of freehold land. Now that's equivalent to a few $1 million today. And at the same time, if you wanted to vote, you would need to hold a mining licence for 12 months. Now I'll talk about this in a minute, most people took out a mining licence for a month because it was quite expensive, like about £5. So we've got this legislative council. You've got the squatters. Then all of a sudden, things change. Gold is discovered. So within the space of 3 years, the population grows from 50,000 to over 250,000. I mean, we complain about a few migrants turning up on the doorstep. We're talking about a 5-fold increase in population. So, what does the Legislative Council do? Because it's frightened that its cheap labour will run off to the goldfields. It's like buying a tax lotto ticket. You get a mining lot, right? You go and look for gold. So what they decided to do was issue gold licences, mining licences. And you've got about 15 square metres for £5 a month. Extraordinary amount. And they issued the gold licence for one reason. They wanted their workers to stay on the land because they surmised that if there was no cost to looking for gold, that they would lose their cheap labour overnight. And they did lose their cheap labour overnight, irrespective of the gold licence. So you've got the situation, right? You've got the gold licences, you've got the squatters' monopoly on the land, you've got all these people that turned up. Now, I don't know how many of you take out a tax lotto ticket. I always take one out when the prize is over $10 million. I've never won, or I wouldn't be here. We'd all be in a luxury hotel doing this presentation. But, you know, you're not going to win. 99.9% of people who look for gold didn't strike it rich. So you're stuck here with these Chartists. These are English revolutionaries or reformers. You've had the failed radical rebellions across Europe in 1848, all these political refugees who had poorly, you know, ideas about equality and fraternity and all that crap, you know, in their heads. And they came here and they wanted to create a new society which was different to what they had left behind for themselves and their children. But they've got no access to land. But before we get to that, you know that in any revolutionary struggle there are always two slogans, land and liberty. And when I talk about, you know, on the radio program, I talk about direct democracy and access to wealth. Land and liberty. Land and liberty are the two constant refrains we've seen millions of people, you know, being executed for and have died for in revolutionary movements around the world. Land and liberty. Well, the Eureka Rebellion was a rebellion about liberty. It was a rebellion about a corrupt state. It was a rebellion to repeal the mining licences to allow miners just to, you know, dig wherever they wanted, even on the squatters' land. And it was about bringing a lot of the ideas that had fomented during the 1848 revolutionary period in Europe into being. It was about liberty. And if you look at the Eureka Oath, we swear by the Southern Cross to stand truly by each other and fight to defend our rights and liberties. It's about liberty, not land. Now, the problem is that with the failure of the Eureka Rebellion on the 3rd of December 1854, the armed rebellion, the failure of the armed rebellion, not the political struggle, which began on the 4th of December 1854, what we saw is tens of thousands of people who hadn't made any money on the goldfields, who there was no industry in this country apart from, you know, working for the squatters, you know, maybe some basic industry like a bakery or metallurgy or whatever, needing access to land to survive. Because they needed to be able to grow their food, rear their animals. So what you've got is the situation at the end of 1854, 1855, when the treason trials, which found the 13 men that had been tried for high treason acquitted, by a jury of their peers, you've got all these unemployed people looking for a mechanism by which to survive. Now, obviously, they can't buy land at auction, they haven't got any money. So they're looking at these squatters who have got a monopoly on the land through leases. Now, everybody thinks that after 1854, every man, as male suffrage, had a vote. It took 4 to 5 years for the actual individual men within Victorian society to actually get a vote. And what happened is in March 1854, the Legislative Council sent a bill to the English Parliament for passage and royal assent, which basically left the Legislative Council in the hands of the squatters, because you had to have so much freehold land, so many assets to be able to stand and vote. So you've got this situation. So the first Parliament that was elected in 1857, I think was if I get this right, could be wrong, I think Higgins was the leader. He started with H anyway, Higgins. And they put out a bill. No. Hotham had died on the 31st.
No, he didn't buy it from it.
No. It doesn't matter who it was. We'll just say the first Parliament. We can fill that in later. First Parliament, right? They put a bill in the Legislative Assembly to actually support the Standing Orders of 1847, where the squatters' leasehold title would eventually be converted to a freehold title, which was the end of the struggle. Now, in 1856, the Victorian Land League was formed, and that was formed, it was initiated by two men, Mr. John Walsh, who's a bloody journalist, a radical journalist, we don't have many of them today, and Thomas Loader. And they were quite smart people, and they understood that the land question was the central question on people's minds. Eureka was behind them. The death of the ones involved was behind them. They needed access to land, so they formed the Victorian Land League. So, how did the Victorian Land League go about the business of actually organising people in Victoria regarding the question of land ownership? The first thing they did is the old Chartist strategy of sending out a petition out into Victoria. And tens of thousands of people signed a petition for land reform. Tens of thousands. So they had some credibility in the eyes. I think it was the Haynes government. They had some credibility in the eyes of people. So what do you do when you don't actually have any representation in Parliament or minimal representation in Parliament? You have to mobilise people. So the first thing they did is they sent out the petition, which alerted people to the fact that the Haynes government, the first government, was going to actually pass legislation to basically maintain the Standing Orders of 1847, which would basically give control of land to the squatters. So what happened? They said, we need a Congress. We need a Congress. On the 15th of June, remember there are no mobile phones like over there. That's my apologies. There are no mobile phones. There are no telephones. There are no fast cars. There's no electric cars. There's no internet. So they send out a letter all over Victoria encouraging communities on the 15th of June, 1857, encouraging people to elect delegates on the question of the Haynes bill regarding land ownership. And they did two things which are interesting. One, they adopted the Eureka flag as their symbol, because this was the continuation of the Eureka Rebellion. And secondly, what they did is they organised a delegates conference in Melbourne at Keely's Hotel, which no longer exists, because I checked it out, at the corner of Lonsdale Street and Spring Street in Melbourne, which is about 60 metres from Victorian Parliament House. So you've got this situation where the Haynes Bill, Land Bill, Reform Bill, is in Parliament, in the old Parliament, where we haven't got one man, one vote, although there were our friend Mr. Peter Laylaw and Mr. Humphrey, the so-called leaders of the Eureka Rebellion, were actually in Parliament at that stage as members for Ballarat, but I'll talk about that in a minute. And so they organised these delegates, these meetings. So they held a 3-week conference from the 16th of July to the 6th of August at Keely's Hotel. And in a democratic way, the first thing that happened is the interim chairperson, who was the secretary, Mr. Loader, vacated the seat, and one of the delegates was appointed as chairperson of the meeting. And that's the first thing you need to do, because if you're involved in a major reformist struggle, you have to incorporate people in that struggle. If you don't, it becomes into a series of factions, as we see in Victoria today, in Melbourne, Australia, and nothing ever gets done. Factions fighting faction. So they had the debate for 3 weeks on the question of the bill and land ownership. And the slogan that they had is a farm, a rifle, a vote, free grass, no surveying, free selection. When I'm talking about free grass for their animals. Free grass for their animals, mate. Yeah, I can see you getting excited. Yeah. This is in Amsterdam. So the first thing they did, because if you're going to hold an open conference like this, you've got to allow people to speak. The first 3 days were spent listening to the delegates from each region. 89 delegates turned up from each region, talking about what their mandate was, what the local community wanted from this. 3 days they spent on that. Then obviously they started to debate the issues. And they had negotiations with the government of the day. And obviously the Haynes government rejected the negotiations. And this is the irony of it all. After it was debated in the lower house, the House of this Assembly, we had Peter Laylaw supporting the bill to allow the squatters to maintain freehold title, and we had Humphrey, who was the leader of the peaceful faction of the Eureka Rebellion, was against the bill. And after that, Laylaw could not show his face in Ballarat, and he had to go into a conservative area to be elected in the future. Yeah, so everybody thinks that Peter Laylaw was a great hero, but within 2 years he was on their side. So you've got this situation. So the bill now goes to the upper house. Now John Faulkner, those of you who know your Melbourne history, John Faulkner and his name Batman, they fought for the honour of being the father of Melbourne, right? Now Batman died soon after he arrived with syphilis, but Faulkner continued. And he was a member, 20 years later, this is 1857, he was a member of the upper house. And he led the debate. And you know what they did? They voted down the Haynes Land Reform Bill because they believed that it would put too many boundaries on the squatters because they didn't want it to be surveyed, right? They didn't want the land to be surveyed, so they rejected the bill. So this was a Pyrrhic victory, right? But we get back to terminology. This is what I found. I found this exciting. I did this research in 2006 and did a pamphlet, little booklet, presented it in 2007. And I knew that the minutes of the land convention, that's what it was called, were in the state library. Somehow I found that out. And I went into the state library. And I had to make an appointment. And they put me in a little room. They gave me some white gloves. And they brought out this document, rich document full of fascinating information. And I looked at the book, which I had to sign, and nobody had looked at that document since 1908. 1908. And see, the Victorian Land League, that's what they were called, were more revolutionary than the Eureka Rebels, because the Eureka Rebels were only after liberty. The Land League was after land. And they understood what delegation is all about, because they called their assembly, or their convention, they called it a Congressional Assembly of Delegates. That's what it was called. And when the convention finished after 3 weeks, they set up a standing committee of 21 people, which met every week at the Southern Markets, is where the old Southern Cross Hotel was, just within stone throw of Parliament House, to pursue the issue of land reform. Now, it didn't stop there. In 1860, with the new voting arrangements that occurred for the lower house, where there's one man, one vote, what we saw was the election of the Nicholson government, and they had a program of land reform. And they passed a bill 3 times in the lower house where anybody could get 320 acres of unsurveyed land. They had to pay $1 an acre, but if they didn't have any money, that money would be deferred. So that would have meant the breakdown of the squattocracy, because people would have poured into their estates on a legal basis. And guess what happened in the upper house, where voting mechanism hadn't changed, where it was rejected. Now, what had happened is the convention group had been meeting regularly at the Southern Markets since 1857 to 1860. They'd meet every week.
Southern or Eastern?
Is it Eastern?
Became Eastern later on.
Eastern, yeah. Eastern Markets. Where the old Southern Cross Hotel was. Eastern Markets, yeah. So they met there every week. And they'd have big debates, and you buy your food, you debate the land question, and hundreds, sometimes thousands of people would turn up. So when the Nicholson government's bill for land reform, the breaking down of the stranglehold the squatters had on the land question, there was huge discussion in the Eastern Markets. And on the 28th of August, 1860, thousands of men and women, mainly men, turned up at Parliament House here, broke every window in both the upper house and the lower house. They battled with the constables for 3 hours. 9 constables were hospitalised. Numerous protesters were also hospitalised. A number of protesters, I was never able to find out, instead died on the steps of the Victorian Parliament House in this confrontation. So what did the government do the next day? They held an emergency session, and they passed the Unlawful Assemblies Act. And they also allocated money for the placement of 4 gun emplacements on Parliament House. And during the 1890 strikes, those guns were manned. But the interesting thing was, the question for land reform didn't die out. And there were other attempts by successive lower house, 1860, 62, 64, 66, all failed because of the gerrymandering in the upper house. After a while, the movement changed from a land reform movement to a movement about taxing land. It was about introducing land tax. And over time, we saw a gradual dissolution of that system. But the fascinating thing to me is not the whole struggle is fascinating. But what is really fascinating is the mechanism they used to push their demands. And that mechanism was based on a direct democratic model. It was based on delegation. And it wasn't just based on one conference, but a continuous presence and continuous organisation regarding a central issue which affected everybody. Now, I'd like to go back a few years to the Eureka Rebellion, because a lot of people think, think about mining licenses. I mean, the Eureka Rebellion was based, in my opinion, on 4 pillars. Internationalism, because there were people from many different countries, races, religions. The first person who was tried for high treason was John Joseph, an American slave who'd come here to find from New York, who'd escaped from the South to New York to find his fortune, buried in the Bendigo Cemetery. You can see his...
White Plains. Is it White Plains, the name of the cemetery?
Yeah. When was it 2 years ago they had a ceremony? This was before Buffoon was elected. Yeah, the United States government actually acknowledged him. It's based on international, it's based on direct action. What could be more direct than taking up arms to defend your rights and liberties? That's what they did. It's based on mutual aid or solidarity. They came together because they had a common enemy. They didn't care what colour the common enemy was, as long as all they cared about is the boot on their neck. Right? That was the corrupt Victoria Police, because the Victoria Police were corrupt because they weren't paid much, and they got a percentage of the fines which were collected for the miners for not having their miner's license. I mean, they had motives to make a buck. Yeah. All right. So obviously there was this really bad feeling between the Joes. My apologies, because they were called Joes because they were Latrobe's troops before Hotham. Joe Latrobe, Joseph Latrobe, so they were called the Joes. And then most of them were ticketed leave men. They were poorly paid. They got a bonus if they collected a fine. So they'd race out there and do whatever they could to arrest people. So it was really bad blood. So, and you've got to remember, this is 1854. Everybody's got a bloody gun. This is in 2025. People have got guns. That's the nature of a frontier society, because you need guns to deal with the original inhabitants, right? So they've got guns. So you've got direct action. But the most important part of this, to me, is direct democracy. Because how do you organise a mass movement? What are the structures you organise? Do you do what Adolf Spawn does? You know, our little friends out there, I call them Adolf Spawn, racing around, raising their heads, and or do you, where you've got the father figure or the big leader, everybody's trying to be Führer, or do you organise some type of democratic interaction? So now you've got to remember, Ballarat was different to a lot of other gold mining towns. It had a more radical tendency than most other gold mining towns. It was a permanent fixture because most of the mining was not alluvial, it was underground. So people were there for a fixed period of time. People lived in tents. And on the 11th of November, was it 1854, the Ballarat Reform League was formed. And their job was to coordinate this struggle. So how did they coordinate that struggle? They put up flyers, which were printed freely by some of the more radical newspapers in a tent city of 25,000 people. How many newspapers do you think there were? 5. 1 supported government, 4 supported the miners. So they would print out these flyers, put them up, call a mass meeting. Now you imagine this. We have enough trouble talking to 50 bloody people with a PA system. We're talking about mass meetings in Ballarat of 10,000, and the biggest, the monster meeting, on the 29th of November, 4 days before the Eureka Rebellion was put down in the sea of blood. There was 20,000 people. And among these 20,000 people, there'd be people selling lemonade, trying to make a buck, selling food, like your, like here. They're trying to... So
Grog.
Obviously, you have grog. You have the sly grog shops, and you have the real grog, mainly sly grog. So there's grog, there's everything, right? And you've got to stand there, and you've got to pitch your voice to this huge crowd, and you've got to get some type of agreement. And so they decided on a delegate system. So what would happen? There'd be a mass discussion, which would take hours. They come to some type of conclusion, elect delegates, and then those delegates would go to Melbourne to interact and parley and discuss with the government of the day, which was led by Mr. Hotham, Charles Hotham. So you've got this mechanism of direct democracy. Now, if you look at this concept You can use this concept during the period of the creation of the Soviets in 1905. You can use this concept during the Spanish Revolution. You can use this concept during a period of natural disaster. There's two mechanisms by which you either have an authoritarian figure who has power, real military power, stepping in and trying to manipulate and control the situation, or you rely on people interacting and coming up with solutions which they try to put in place. And the best mechanism is a direct democratic mechanism. We see it when Australian workers were allowed to strike. We would see it during wildcat strikes. We would see it in factories where they struck, where the trade union was normally kept out in many cases because they were seen as traitors. And the workers would elect delegates or appoint delegates to negotiate on their behalf. So what I'm saying is, direct democracy is nothing new. It's a mechanism which is essential for the creation of a reformist or even revolutionary situation, for that situation to go forward. The problem is, people get tired. And that's why I say democracy is not just rule of the people, by the people, for the people. It's about rule of the people, by the people, for the people, by an engaged public. As soon as the public is disengaged because they think the problem has been resolved, then you have the more authoritarian elements, as we saw with the Bolsheviks, come in and take over that revolutionary movement. So I'll leave it with there. So I think Victoria has a good history of direct democracy. And it's very hard, you know. Every 3 years you have elections and, you know, you talk about direct democracy. People somehow think that representation will get there. But let's look at what's happened overseas. Look what happened in Bangladesh. Direct democracy on the streets. Look what just happened in Nepal overnight. Nobody expected it. I don't know, a lot of you people know Ian. He's an old trade unionist, comes up on the steps. Yeah. He was there in Nepal. He had no idea anything was going to happen. It all blew up because people, and these are both so-called democratic countries. You've got to remember that in Nepal they had a Maoist, strong Maoist movement which was involved in a revolutionary action against the monarchy. They overcome the monarchy, they formed a coalition with other elements, and they just became as corrupt as everybody else. So what in those situations, and what did they do to elect new people? They did a poll. Who's a respected member in society? Who can we trust to bring us out of this situation? And people who had substance, who'd done the right thing, who were seen to be incorruptible, were appointed by the crowds to take control of the situation. So maybe I'm being a little bit, you know, I'm feeling it's, like I said about the Victorian Liberal Party today, they've put they've daubed a new coat of paint on the policy, but they've actually put a bit of glitter in the paint this time to make it more attractive. Yeah. So all I'm saying is there is historical precedent. You can go right back. You can look at revolutionary situations. You can look at why they failed. You can look at reformist movements. You can look at how things progress. And that's why as anarchists we have always promoted direct democracy as an alternative. Not consensus, but direct democracy as an alternative. Questions, please, before I bore you to tears.
Has there been much or any advocacy for delegations to support, you know, parliamentary democracy in Australia? I don't think so, because it's so bad.
I mean, the only time that you get reform is when you've got people entering a political party to promote reforms, as we saw during the Whitlam-led Labor government, where people think it was the reforms were initiated by the Labor Party. The reforms were, I lived here then. Jeremy lived here then. We're old enough to remember. Not like Paul, who's a young whippersnapper. I don't think you were ever. Were you born in 1975, Paul? No. But the thing is, it came from below. The push for reform came from below through a parliamentary system. And the difference between the Whitlam-led Labor government and the Albanese government, it was a government based on the redistribution of wealth. That's what it was policy, and they tried to implement that policy. Redistribution of wealth, not protecting corporate interests, people who are wealthy, which we see today as the Labor Party. There's no questions, there's lots of food, drinks. Can I encourage you all to come to Eureka? And this time, hopefully Jeremy comes to the right place. It's the corner of Eureka and Stall Street in Ballarat. We've got 6 wonderful medalists, people you may have never heard of who've done extraordinary things. There's an old lady which was recommended, who I interviewed on Radical Australia a few weeks ago, called Eve Sharp. She was a member of the International Peace Brigade and was a human shield in Central America during the bad days when the CIA and the local fascists were executing people. And her job was to sit in meetings, trade union meetings, or go to people's houses who were targeted for assassination. And she would do that. She did that for 30 years. She's a lady from Britain, but lived in Australia most of her life. And she's 85, lives in a nursing home. Extraordinary story. Nobody's heard of her. And we've got other people, who've worked really hard over decades to do things, to bring reforms into play. And then what happens every time? All the bastards that have been against the reform claim the credit. They say it was me. And that's why I organise these things, because it's important we remember these things and we celebrate our victories.
Joe, just from what you've said, direct democracy movements more influential than anything else.
Well, it's influential because it actually means if you're involved in the direct democratic movement, you feel part of the decision. So the trouble today is that representative democracy, we feel alienated from the decisions they make. And so direct democracy, as we see in a lot of traditional societies, is a mechanism by which you have involvement. It's like if you're involved in a particular project.
When you claim your own power, you express it.
That's right.
Is it interchangeable with participatory democracy? That's a term that gets used a fair bit.
Maybe, I don't think so. Participatory isn't.
Maybe it's more of an overseas thing.
Yeah. Participatory democracy is really not direct democracy.
Okay.
You can have participatory. You can have it. It's kind of participatory. You like that? Participatory. You can do a roast on that. But participatory democracy. Yeah. No, direct democracy is different. It really comes from an and you need to be able to use it to organise. I mean, when I organise, look, I do it when I organise little things, right? What's the thing I do? If you go to Eureka, if those of you who came, I think there was one of them, who came to the Whitlam thing, what do I do whenever I organise an event? I allow each person to express their opinion. If they don't want to express them, I force them to express their opinion. And that's important because it means that then the group feels that they own the event, that they are part of the event. They're not just spectators. What was the old surrealist slogan? The spectators, the society of the spectacle, was it? Yeah. We're not spectators. We're participants. But the public has to be engaged. As soon as they lose, you get the authoritarian elements which are better organised, have got their cadres, move in and take over.